Hey, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Charles Reyes and I manage the tank subcommittee here at ASTSWMO. Today we're going to be presenting EPA's national database for UST facilities and LUS sites presented by EPA's Office of Research and Development, ORD. Just to go over a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, we're going to hold them all for the end, but please use the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. I'm going to compile these up and bring them up following the presentation and allow the presenters to answer or other states. Depending on the time available at the end, we may also open up the lines for any discussion and Q&A. This webinar is also going to be archived and available on ASTSWMO's website shortly following today's presentation. And again, any questions after this, feel free to email me. This is Charles at ASTSWMO, and I will get them over to Fran Kramer at ORD or any of the states who asked the questions. So now I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn Hoskinson from EPA's Office of Underground Storage Tanks, who's going to provide a short welcome to get us started. Carolyn?
Excellent. Thank you, Charles. So I am super nerdy and love data, and I am so excited to be at the point where we're having this conversation with all of you about the work that ORD has done to try to create a national database. I've been in the Office of Underground Storage Tanks for 13 years, which makes me a relative newbie compared to some people in the tanks program. And one of the most frequent conversations we have that's really upsetting is to say, well, we don't have any data on that. We don't have a database. We don't have an answer to that question. And so I'm really excited to have the opportunity to have some kind of national data. I also love maps. I think maps tell a really good story, and the ability to be able to map where tank sites are in the country is, again, something nationally at least we've never been able to do. Some states are way ahead of us, which is always the case in this program. And so, again, I'm excited to have an opportunity to create a national picture in a way that we never have before. So I'm really looking forward to all of you participating today, really being able to look at the work that was done and give some input into it. And in particular, this is data that ORD compiled by getting it from all the various different states. And I think it's going to be really important for each of you to make sure that we interpreted your data correctly and that we're not somehow misconstruing the data that we got from you, because this is all your stuff that we used in this application. So I hope that each of you will take the opportunity to dive in and look at it and check it. And make sure that it's actually good enough for us to do something with it, because I'm really excited to use it, but I don't want to use it until we know that all of you are saying, yeah, this is good. You guys did a good job with this, and it's something that you should be able to use. So, so again, I just really appreciate it, and I look forward to you guys seeing what we've done and then giving us some feedback on it.
Hi, this is Tara. I'm lucky enough to be here today to introduce your presenters. I appreciate everything that Carolyn just said, but as a state regulator, I think it's important for you to be open-minded when you're looking at what's going to be presented, because there are incredible state-centric applications for using this information in this tool, and along with making sure that our state data is correct, we are going to be able to so improve our ability to serve our customers and our programs. So you're going to hear more from ASTSWMO in the future as we reach out to state representatives and ask you not only to verify your data, but to use the tool and identify areas where you feel that you're going to have an increased need or want to use it. This is something that has been created to serve all of us. So for our brilliant presenters, we've got Fran Kramer and Alex Hall. Fran actually received her PhD in environmental engineering, and she's worked with EPA's Office of Research and Development for around 30 years. She started when she was very young. She spent most of her career focused on petroleum hydrocarbon contamination. And not only has she done work at the tank level and with monitored natural attenuation and developing national policies, but she's actually worked on efforts related to the Exxon Valdez and Deepwater Horizon spills. So she has a tremendous amount of very useful experience. She's currently heading up the Office of Research Development's research on UST projects and covering everything from leak prevention, cleanup, and finding out more about the impacts of emerging fuel blends on the infrastructure that we currently have. Alex got his master's in geography in 2013, and he's been an incredible asset for EPA, and I believe he's been working there around 6 years. He's a research fellow with Oak Ridge Institute for Science and Education. He conducts research on underground storage tanks, oil spill response, geostatistics, and geographical information systems. And I believe you're going to be entirely blown away when you see the work that they've done. So, presenters, please take it away.
Oh, well, that's quite an introduction. Thank you so much. But I think at the same time, I'm extremely grateful to Charles and to Danya for your support in ASTSWMO, as well as the ASTSWMO task forces who've really been great partners in this. And we've been working here at ORD with ALS for many years. And as Carolyn mentioned, we're extremely excited to be able to have a national picture of the tanks and infrastructure, and especially the geospatial information that's associated with it. And if you just think, taking a step back for a moment about just the infrastructure in this country, we have infrastructure information on water treatment plants, on wastewater treatment plants, major infrastructure supporting our country, but we've never had this kind of data until now. So it really gives us a way to think about not only how we think about prevention and cleanup, but as well as you'll see in the course of this discussion, as well as an important aspect in how we look at emergency response and how we think about the future and protecting public health. So today we're going to cover, one, broadly, just the utility of this national data set, and then Alex is going to go into a discussion about the various sources of data that are coming from the states, encompassing 150-some different databases. And he'll describe some of the results of the analysis from that database, and then most importantly, do a demonstration of the app, and then how you'll be looking at the information and the data that's contained in the app. So first off, looking at how this data can be used. Certainly the infrastructure data is just really some key information that the states have amassed over the years. So what will be presented in here includes the age and the type of the infrastructure, and identify potential vulnerabilities that we may have collectively with regard to the infrastructure. And importantly, the geospatial data that's provided in here really gives us a unique insight into impacts that we may have relative to water supplies and ultimately public health. So we have a layer in app that includes proximity to private domestic wells as an example. And this is based on a recent method that we've developed in locating private domestic wells across the country by census block. Then secondly, it'll identify then facilities we have that are residing in the FEMA 100-year floodplain. So it gives us collectively information about facilities that may be impacted. And then thirdly, also with this is to think about potential for petroleum vapor intrusion risk, and then ultimately look at populations that are in proximity to these facilities, how we would think about either exposure through water or air and impacts to nearby residents. And then ultimately too, I think the important takeaway here is we in our community here and looking at tanks, we certainly are looking at routine operations. How do we improve what we do to day? How do we develop better conceptual site models? How do we understand transport of contaminants? But as this will show you too, in thinking about emergency response and thinking about more dynamic conditions that we're experiencing with extreme weather change and weather environments, that is something that we'll need to encompass in how we think about our sites and potential movement of contaminants. Um, Many may not be familiar. This is a new act that was just passed in 2018, and this act really, while it is not directly was not directly targeted for our world in the tanks, our tanks community certainly can help in responding to this. This act really requires that drinking water facilities be able to provide information about particular risks that may be presented by facilities in proximity both to the drinking water facility itself as well as the drinking water intakes in their facility. And so one of the key things that we are, of course, looking at is to help them identify information relative to where our tanks facilities are located. The drinking water facilities have different compliance deadlines, and it's based on the size of the facility. So some are due, the larger facilities are due in the spring, whereas the smaller drinking water facilities, this information is due in the middle of 2021. So in this light, certainly information that we have in here can be extremely useful to these drinking water facilities and ultimately the community public health that would be impacted by that. As many of you, I'm sure, on the phone experienced through the course of the considerable flooding that we experienced in the Midwest this year, we saw firsthand, as shown here, you know, many of our earlier concerns were just our tanks getting inundated and product being displaced. However, it was also evident that we're just losing complete tanks in these types of environments. I mean, flooding that's so extensive beyond what we really have thought about. So it really changes our thinking about how we consider flooding impacts. And we are, as a side note, also working with ALS to consider updating the flood guidance in the future too, and thinking about ways that we can improve our efforts here in light of the extreme flooding that we've been experiencing. And then I think the other relevant aspect to flooding that we have seen this year, particularly in the lower Mississippi, is the long-term flooding that has been nearly unprecedented. So we have some facilities that have been underwater literally for months. So not only are we concerned about the loss of the product, but the extensive corrosion of infrastructure that can occur in these environments. Water is really the Achilles heel for our facilities and inducing corrosion. So this becomes a significant factor in how we think about flooding. Likewise, where we have particular conceptual models in mind and how we undertake our treatment and remediation efforts, it's, you know, fairly static conditions that we're thinking about in terms of the environment of where the spills are found. When we have these floods, obviously those conceptual models are really impacted, and so we need to really rethink how we're addressing these types of environments. And then last but not least is just even getting access to these facilities to get them stabilized, to get them under control, to address the free product that may be around and or contain the product that remains in the tank. So it gives us a little bit different situation, and this tool can help us think about ways to consider where flooding is occurring, consider the extent of flooding, and help to make some strategic decisions both locally at the state level and the national level to address this. And along with this comes also vulnerability to groundwater. So where we see either in flood conditions or heavy precipitation events, the ground level are going to be in flux. And certainly those are going to be challenges to our leaking underground storage tanks as well as our underground storage tanks, and how we look at protecting both the infrastructure and also cleaning up these facilities. Where we're in coastal environments, saltwater intrusion will be especially problematic as it will accelerate the rates of corrosion in these facilities. And then last but not least, too, here again, it's going to complicate how we look at cleanup of these facilities and address the groundwater contamination. Here is presented an example of, on the left-hand side, of NOAA's predictions for the spring flood outlook, and certainly what their predictions are or were changed fast. And what's shown on the right-hand side is the USGS stream flood gauges through the spring and into the summer, certainly showing impacts to the same waterways that were predicted. One of the key efforts that we have in mind to use this tool is really to coordinate with NOAA and getting information on spring floods and be able to get that information out to the states in advance of the floods occurring, so that there's some advance warning that what may be coming, and help to stabilize facilities and take some action really to button down our facilities. And then overall, when we look at the national response framework, of which EPA has a strategic role in this as well, one of our key responsibilities is getting information about the hazards and analyzing this information geospatially. So we're also hoping that this tool can assist in this effort in identifying information. And having worked on several national emergency response operations, it is very critical, especially in the early response efforts, to have good data and information available that's readily accessible, because decisions, especially in the early phases, are very rapid. And so having that data available to our response network is absolutely critical, and we hope that this tool, and certainly with your input and assistance, that we can make this information readily available. And again, certainly want to work with the state folks in developing this. And then likewise at the state and local level, how you look at infrastructure, how you look at building codes or development that occurs in thinking about the present day and into the future will be critical in this as well. And then lastly, on the right-hand side of the slide is just a general picture of showing some population shifts that are occurring in the country. And the purple are where some of the major shifts are occurring, or higher percentage of shifts are occurring. And so you can see certainly in the west, in the south, and the southeast, generally the coastal areas are going to see population increases. And we know there's of course, a direct correlation where we see population increases, that we're likely to see increases in gas stations being constructed. So how we think about this strategically, in particular in areas that may be more vulnerable, will be something for us to work on collectively. So now I'm going to turn it over to Alex, and he's going to go through with you the database information and some of the early results, and again, work through a demonstration of the app itself.
Great. Thank you, Fran. So yeah, I'm just going to briefly talk about the database structure. And it was said earlier that EPA went to every state and collected information from every state, from the UST and the leak and underground storage tank departments, and we collated them into a single national database. That was a big challenge because every state has kind of different database structures and different ways of organizing their data. But so the real effort was to standardize it into a single format, and that is what we did, and that's what we'll be showing you. But the graphic you're seeing here shows in the middle the three databases that were developed. On the left is the individual underground storage tank database. That's for every single tank in a state. We have that for 48 states and DC. Included in that database would be the installation date, the removal date, the status, whether it's open or closed, and whether that tank is double-walled or single-walled. And then we have a linking facility ID. We also have the UST capacity and the fuel type. We use the fuel type to remove on-site home heating oil tanks. So one of the national databases. And then over here on the right, we've got the leaking underground storage tank database. We have that for all states and DC. We have the coordinates, we've got the release date, and whether the site is no further action or active. Inactive could be any variation, monitoring, remediation, so on. And then in the middle here, we've got the facility database, and we have that for all 50 states. We've got the coordinates and the count of open, closed, and temporarily closed underground storage tanks. The facility database and the LUST database is spatial. We map them, and then the individual underground storage tanks are linked to the facility database. I'll show you that later. So, we map them. For the first time, we've got kind of a national picture of, and what we're looking at here is the leaking underground storage tanks. And we're able to look at this nationally, and what you're seeing here is every point on that map is the number of leaking underground storage tanks per 10 square miles. Just looking at it, you can see that pretty much every metropolitan area in this country has between 150 and almost 1,000 leaking underground storage tanks. And then since we collected and collated all this data into a single database, we were able to kind of ask some simple but important questions. We wanted to know what's the average age of a UST at the time of removal, and how has that changed over time? The graph on the right, the blue line shows the age of the tank at the time of removal, and you can see that from 1985, the average age of a tank at removal date was 17 years old. Well, today that's doubled. The average tank at time of removal is 33. The gray area here are the number of UST removals. So there's definitely a trend happening, and this data will help us hypothesize why this may be occurring. So we've populated all of the state data with supplemental information, and one of the supplemental data points would be the potential petroleum vapor intrusion of every single leaking underground storage tank and underground storage tank. Basically what we did was we took every single building structure in the United States and we calculated how many buildings are within 300 feet of every leaking underground storage tank and underground storage tank. Here's just an example of what we did in Cincinnati. Every red building here is within, well, here it's 1,500 feet of a leaking underground storage tank. So embedded in the web data is the count of buildings within 300 feet of every leaking underground storage tank. Also embedded in the data is the number of, or whether a tank is within a 100-year flood zone or not. Nationally, the national pictures show that there were 33,000 underground storage tanks within FEMA's 100-year floodplain. That was totaling 250 million gallons of fuel or hazardous substance. And the average age of a UST within these flood zones is about 25 years old. And then just to look at this by state, we've got the count of active underground storage tanks within FEMA's 100-year floodplain. And you can kind of look at the state distribution here. Pennsylvania had the most, followed by Texas and Ohio and Florida. And then we could also just kind of apply this data a little bit more locally. We could look at what happened during Hurricane Harvey. And we knew all the areas in Hurricane Harvey where there was flood inundation. So we kind of overlaid the facility data, and we saw that, well, there were 500 facilities inundated by water during that hurricane, equaling 1,200 underground storage tanks. There was approximately 15.4 million gallons of fuel that were inundated. And here we can just kind of dig into the data a little bit more. The graph on the left just shows the number of underground storage tanks inundated by tank age. And you can see most of the tanks that were inundated were very old, or fairly old, between 30 and 40 years old. And the older tanks didn't have as many double-walled systems. That was that's shown in the blue there. The picture on the right is just a gas station that was built just a few months before Harvey in a 100-year floodplain. So we're hoping that maybe some of this data can be used at looking at, sites currently in the 100-year floodplain and potential maybe future construction of sites. And then with that, I'm just going to go and give you a brief demonstration of the app and how it works. So if you request access to the application, you'll get an email, and you'll just follow the instructions and sign in. When you sign in, this will be your launching page. And then what you'll do is, and there'll be instructions for this too, but just so I can briefly go over it. You'll go to the Groups tab here, and then you'll click on the database. And then from here, you can click this button and it'll launch the application. And when the application launches, this is what you'll see. And what you're looking at here is kind of the bird's eye view of the aggregated data by county. So right now you're looking at the number of underground storage tank releases by county. And this is dynamic. You can click on any county and you can get kind of the overview for that county. Here, this county, there were 280 releases, 29 open underground, leaking underground storage tanks, and 251 closed. And then here we've got the number of lost sites within a floodplain, the population within 133,000 people live within 1,500 feet of a leaking underground storage tank, the number of private domestic wells within 150,000, and the number of buildings. And so this button right over here is where all the data resides. Under this tab is all the spatial data. Here we're looking at the leaking underground storage tanks, and here are the count of underground storage tank facilities by county. And again, this contains the same information, but here we've got the number of open USTs and the number of closed. So now we can kind of dig into the data more and look at the individual locations. So we can go anywhere in the country, and then we can look at where all the leaking underground storage tanks are. The map is symbolized by the gray is a closed leaking underground storage tank, and the red is an open underground storage tank. And just like the counties, you can click on any site. You can get information for that particular site. Here is the leaking underground storage tank ID, and this is taken from the state. So if you want to go back to the state database, you can find that number associated with that leak. And then we've got the incident date here. So we've got this for all 550,000 leaking underground storage tanks. And then importantly, we've got how the point was mapped. So here we geocoded, this identifies that we geocoded the address, that the EPA did this. And you can see here that the site was geocoded and the point was placed on the street intersection. So what it did is it read an address, here Tennyson and Packer, and then the geocoder placed it on that intersection. This allows you to kind of query the accuracy of the location. You can have the accuracy be a zip code, which would not be that accurate, or a point address, which would be very accurate. So with this site, we can look at the population. There's 900 people within 1,500 feet of that site. The number of private domestic wells would be 18, and 2 buildings. If we can zoom into the area and we can look at the base map and see that, well, it said that there were 18 private domestic wells within 1,500 feet, and that kind of checks out just visual approximation. There's about 18 homes around here, and this is in the kind of the suburban area of Madison. That's probably not hooked up to the municipal water line. So So we want to make this very easy for you or the public or anybody wanting to use this, and we included some kind of pre-made filters here where you can query things like the status of the tank. Let's say I'm only interested in open leaking underground storage tanks. We can just click that button, and then we can just look at the open tanks. We can, down here, we can query by the incident date. So let's say I want to see all of the leaking underground storage tanks that happened August 1st, 2013 and after. So we can do that, and then you can query that way. And then we can ask the question, what leaking underground storage tanks has at least 12 private domestic wells within 1,500 feet? And you can see, well, obviously Chicago's not going to have very many private domestic wells, so that was queried out. Another feature in this application is you can view this data as a table to look at multiple sites at once. And what's in the table is dynamically linked to the map. So what you're seeing in the map is what's being showed in the table. Here it says there's 9,300 sites within this extent. And we can just do kind of quick queries. We can look at the highest number of buildings within 300 feet if you're worried about vapor intrusion. So this site, it says it has 83 buildings within 300 feet. We can zoom into this area. We can look at the map, and we can see we've got really high housing density here. I should note that this data can be exported to an Excel or a text file. So if you're not really comfortable with the map, or you want to look at this as a spreadsheet, you can go here and you can just export the data that you're viewing in the table to a CSV. And you can do that for all the leaking underground storage tanks, facilities, the tanks, and the leaking sites. So that would be the leaking underground storage tank data. Now let's look at the facility database. I'm going to hop over to where I am in Cincinnati. And all the facilities pop up. The blue denotes that it's a facility with at least one active underground storage tank. And then the light blue is basically a legacy facility where there's no active underground storage tanks. And then this works very similar to the leaking underground storage tank database. You can zoom into any area. Currently, I'm sitting about right here. And from this map, I learned that there were underground storage tanks at the EPA that where I'm at right now. And you can click it and get the same kind of information. The address. Here, the coordinates were provided by the state. So if the state had coordinates in their database, we used those coordinates. If they didn't, then we geocoded it. And then, so at this facility, we see that there's 3 underground storage tanks. And then we get the regular population, private domestic well, and building data. Now let's say I want to dig into the 3 individual tanks more. I can do that. I can go here and I can look at the related table. The related table would be the individual tank table. And it's showing 3 entries for the 3 open tanks. I can click one and get tank information. So that this would be the state facility ID right there. It's in the installation date. This was installed in 1990. The capacity of the tank, it's denoting that it's open, and it's denoting that it's double walled. You can also view this in an attribute table, and we see all 3 associated with the facility with all that data. Okay, and I should say, so you can open up all the the facility database and click on multiple facilities and then extract all the individual tank information from those facilities. Now let's say I'm interested in just data from a single state, and I want to just look at just state data. What you can do is you can go into here into the query section, and you can go and pick what state you're interested in. So let's say I'm interested in Utah. All I need to do is turn that button on and move over to Utah. I had a ways to go. Now I should note that this database contains, let me turn it on, that would help. Okay, so this database contains about 4 million data points. So right now it's working very well, but you may need to give it, a few seconds or even a minute to load the data sometimes. But okay, so here we're looking at all the leaking underground storage tanks in Utah. And let's say I'm just interested in just open or active leaking underground storage tanks. We can click that button. And then to kind of review the data or look at it statewide, all we need to do is open up the attribute table. And then here it says there's 282 active leaking underground storage tanks. We can review the data this way, or we can just export the data to a CSV and just review it in Excel. So we try to make it easy for people to navigate. I guess that's probably all I have so far. Do we want to turn it over to questions?
All right, sorry about that. We've only got one question that came in now. So again, if you guys want to ask questions, use the question box. It looks like we will have a little bit of time at the end that might be able to open up the speakers as well. So if you feel like you have a question that would require a little bit of back and forth, use the raise my hand feature. Should look just like a raised hand. Click on that and then I can unmute your line. So the only question we have in right now are, what are the light blue squares that show up on the UST facilities layer, not the dark blue or gray?
Those were bus stops that were on the base map. So I didn't make them. It was embedded in the base map that I was showing.
And
that was an easy one.
Next question is, this is one that we were prepared for. So I don't recall sending in any of our data. When and where is this from?
Yeah, definitely. The data here is a static snapshot in time. We collected this data between approximately September of 2018 to May of 2019. And we took this data from state websites, and we also made personal inquiries with various people to get data.
But by and large, it's coming from public information that's available on state websites.
Right. The next one, and we've actually got this a few times already. How often will the data be updated, and how will that be done?
That's an ongoing discussion at the moment, and so we've had some preliminary conversations that tentatively we're thinking about every other year to do this, but we also want to make this decision, obviously, in conjunction with the states and see what's most beneficial for them. This was obviously a heavy lift, and to do this for the first time, it was a lot of hours and a lot of Alex's time and just brute force and putting this together. The next round won't be as time consuming, but nonetheless still would be still quite a bit of an effort. So we're definitely interested in engaging with folks at the states and ASTSWMO on how best to do that and the timing.
We have a question, how do I access the database?
Well, Charles, do you want to, maybe it's an opportune time just to explain this review process first?
Sure, I'll turn it over to you about the possible date, but what we're going to do, and I guess I can make the announcement now, and before we end, we'll make it again, is we'd like to have at least one point of contact from every state and territory for reviewing data that's currently in the database, accessing the data before it goes public to see if we need to make any corrections. We learned that some of this may have been provided, as Alex and Fran said, just by pulling on data that's already out there publicly. Some were provided by maybe somebody that's not in the tanks program. But one of the things we want to do, and I will send an announcement to all the folks on the webinar today, is have that one point of contact from the tanks program that can help us review this before it goes public. We're hoping to get that by the end of the month from most of you, if not all of you. All of you would be great. And we're going to be using members on our Emerging Fuels Task Force to help coordinate this effort, both finding the points of contact and then any future back and forth that we need to do to update the data going forward.
And then after that review, and so we'll have the list of names for Charles then, and we hope maybe the end of November or so. So depending upon the nature of the comments, I would hope by sometime early next year, then we would have a final data set ready to go, and we would then be publishing this on the Geo platform, so that would be publicly available. So during this review time, it's just going to be open to folks who are engaged in reviewing the data, but again, early next year, that will be widely available.
And I should say, when you give your name to Charles, then within a few days, you'll get an email from the EPA with instructions on how to access the web app.
Okay. Next question was, any data you recommend that some states collect about tanks to paint a better picture nationally? I guess this goes to the consistency from state to state.
Actually, it's a great question, and one that we just have been having with a number of the ASTSWMO task force groups. And probably just as an example, this week in a conversation with the emerging task force folks, is just even looking at how the fuels that are stored in the tanks is labeled. And so there's quite an array of labeling for these substances across the states. And one of the things that we're interested in, of course, is understanding at a more granular level the type of fuel. For example, the broad categories of diesel. Well, biodiesel would absolutely help us. And then likewise, some is just labeled as ethanol, and as well, the percentage of ethanol would be helpful. So this is a point I think we're absolutely most interested in working with the ASTSWMO task forces and the states to figure out how we think about the labels associated with the fuel and ways that can help us understand both on the prevention side, looking at corrosion, and then also on the cleanup side too.
And this is a reminder for the panelists and organizers. You can unmute yourself too if you need to add anything from a SWMO or ALS perspective. Question about the leaking UST map. Is this data by facility or individual release?
So it's by individual release, but if the state provided a facility ID, you can see here in the map here, this release has a LUST ID and a facility. But so we, just in brief, it's the release location, but if there was a facility linked to it, we included the facility ID.
You mentioned that 48 states and DC provided data for the database, for UST's database. Which are the 2 states that do not have data
I was unable to access it from Idaho, and California, we don't have it for California, and that's more of a complex reason, but currently we do not have it.
All right. Is the data on an Esri GIS platform?
Yes. It's the EPA's Geo platform is an Esri platform. And yeah, I should add you can add data from Esri's database. You know, you can query pretty much anything you want to look at, and you can add it to this map. Or if your department has an Esri account, you know, you can input your department's data and overlay it with this map.
But I think maybe just to add to this as well, certainly for folks in the state who are out in the field, if they need information, they can directly access this app while they're in the field. So if they're looking at a facility and asking, well, how many private domestic wells would be in proximity, they can pull that information right up in the palm of their hand.
Was the presence of basements in a building considered when determining potential for vapor intrusion?
We have put in a particular number just for distance, just as a screening level for PVI. We have relatedly, there's a different tool, it's called the PVI screen tool that Jim Weaver had developed, and that would be a much finer detail to assess particular problems with regard to PVI. As well, we're already, even though we haven't got version 1 totally released, we're already thinking about version 2. And so on that, we're looking at a sliding scale both for PVI and as well potential groundwater impacts and distances from facilities. And again, that would accommodate the dynamic conditions, say, that would be occurring under flood or other types of events that would significantly alter either the groundwater contaminant plume and or potential for vapor intrusion.
If states remove sites, tanks, etc., will EPA database continue to show them, or will a fresh dump of all sites repopulate the EPA site?
Now, this is a static map. It's static, depending on the state, between September of 2018 and May of 2019. You know, we're still discussing the, you know, how frequently we update it. But when we update it, it'll be updated. Unfortunately, this is not dynamic with the state data.
States with unregulated tanks listed, can those aspects be refined for the search?
Can you repeat that?
I'll just read word for word. What about states with unregulated tanks listed? Can those aspects be refined for the searcher? For the public that's searching.
So we made every effort to only include USTs that were federally regulated. It was trickier from some states to others, but yeah, just like we try to pull out home heating oil tanks, but you can't refine it like that. You can't look at just unregulated tanks.
Will this include brownfield or locations where LNAPL have been left behind?
Well, it doesn't include it, but like I said before, if you're interested in brownfield locations, you can search Esri's or EPA's database, spatial database. So I could probably type, you know, brownfields in here and get a layer. So it's not included, but you may be able to add it.
Well, and then it also, this information includes the sites that are closed. So depending upon whether you'd have the geospatial information about the brownfield, I mean, you might find some historical information here about the closed sites if that's relevant for you.
And will you also include in record if the data comes from a state's database? Or is this going to be listed in some way?
All the data comes from the state database. So there wouldn't be anything else that we've added to this.
And I think a follow-up, this is just for me, Charles. So will there be a resource page where folks will be able to go straight to that state to see where the data came from?
So we have it embedded in the metadata, which may not be the easiest way for people to look. That's a good question. Maybe we should have a documents page or documentation page. But so that's, yeah.
And when we have all the individuals who'll be reviewing the data, Alex as well put together kind of a guide, a how-to guide to go through the app and define the different parameters and information that's in there. So that will be distributed to all the individuals who will be reviewing the data.
Do you anticipate insurance underwriters will use this tool as a way to price coverage for USTs?
Oh, I don't know. Probably somebody from ALF should answer that question.
This is Tara. The insurance providers that we've spoken to through ASTSWMO groups have indicated that as more and more information is made available, they're more than happy to look at it. But I doubt that you're going to get a commitment on whether or not that's going to impact the rates that they have.
Okay. The tank data seems to focus on the age of tanks, which is just a fraction of where releases begin. Are there plans to collect information about other components, piping, spill buckets, dispensers, etc.?
That would be great. The problem that I ran into was every state has a different nomenclature and a way of describing like what pipe type or spill bucket type. It's very hard to collate that into a single database. We try to pull out information that was consistent through all states, like is the tank double walled or single walled.
And it may be something we could do in the future, but I think we'd probably have to figure out a way minimally to aggregate some of that information to be able to put it in a form that makes the most sense and to be able ultimately to make decisions from that. But that information was so diverse in its entries that, that was just hard to get our arms around.
And are these only federally regulated USTs?
Every effort was made to only include federally regulated USTs. That's not saying that there may be some non-regulated. Some states, it was hard for us to just differentiate between regulated and not regulated. But in general, yes.
And then here's a follow-up to a previous question. Sorry if I missed it, but I didn't understand the answer about whether tanks that have been removed will show up on the map or database.
Yes, they will. So there's a removal date column embedded in the underground storage tank database, and it will give you the removal date. And if the state did not provide a removal date, but they knew it was removed, it'll have an X. So it's clearly denoted in the attribute table if the tank was pulled or not.
Where do you get the domestic well information? It's not something we include in our database.
We've been working on this problem for some time. and realizing that 1990, the National Census was the last time that the question was asked was, where do you get your water from? And so there was data there from the 1990 census. And so we it just recently developed a method, it's going to be published shortly, that defines that information and updates it using the community survey as well as state drill logs to ultimately refine the location of domestic wells by census block. So it doesn't provide the exact geolocation of the private domestic wells because we want to protect that privacy, but it provides the density of private wells within that census block. So for our folks in the tanks community, then we'll have a much better idea of the density of those wells in proximity to our facilities. And so that's a layer that we've added on here based on that method.
Sorry, I'm just grouping a few questions together. My state has a GIS layer as well as a database extract on our website. How will I know which data source you accessed?
I could tell you you could email me, but in the metadata for these layers, we include what department we got or branch we got the data from. We don't go into any more detail on the metadata, but we certainly have that information if you contact us directly.
Will public records, state source and calls data be linked?
I don't understand the question. I'm sorry.
If I read this correctly, some states are very specific in source and calls of release, and they want to know if that data will be available. And if I'm not reading that question correctly, for the person who asked it, put the raise hand button on and we can clarify.
This is Mark from AST. I think as part of the public records each state puts forward every year, they include source and cause information. But Alex, I'm pretty sure that would not be part of your database, and that you are only using the data that you could get commonalities across all the states, correct?
Correct. It doesn't have that information.
Alternatively, if we feel that that's data that we'd want to look at nationally, I mean, I think it would be something that certainly would warrant further discussion if you feel that would be important.
Will the data say if it was geocoded versus coordinates provided from the state?
Yeah, definitely. So here we're looking at the leaking underground storage tanks. This coordinate source here, the state provided it. If the state did not provide a coordinate, it'll say geocode. And if it was geocoded, it'll give you the kind of the precision or the accuracy of the geocoder.
Are there plans to map sites where institutional controls or environmental covenants are in place?
That issue hasn't come up with us. But again, I think if folks broadly think that that's an important element, we'd be more than happy to consider that in the future.
If no data was provided from California, where did you get the California data that's visible on the map?
Yeah, so California publishes a data set of all active, all facilities with at least one underground storage tank. So we have the facility data, and we know that there's at least one active UST. That's the data that we have. We don't have the individual tank database. We only have the facility database.
I believe USGS has data for drinking water wells updated every 2 years. Have you contacted them?
Yeah, we're very familiar with their methodology. Theirs is not as a fine of resolution as the data that we have. And we needed this greater resolution to really be able to geospatially evaluate that relative to tank facilities.
Okay, I'm going to go back to a reminder about the ask for state POCs. A couple of you have already provided it as a question, so that would actually be great right now if you know who that point of contact is going to be to review data, update for the future. Send it to me as a question so I can compile all of this, and we'll have a number of the states out of the way right here during this webinar. We have a question to clarify the expectations for data review. Do you expect the numbers will match exactly, or are you looking for a ballpark or even order of magnitude match?
Well, given this data is a static snapshot that began last September and finished this spring, the data is going to be from that time period. And obviously the state data has evolved and changed since then. So if we're close to the numbers that you have, I think that's really what we're looking for to make sure we're in the ballpark here on the data.
Have Homeland Security concerns been addressed for security concerns like how SARA Title III data is protected?
Actually, we're going to be meeting with some of our folks in Homeland Security just to provide the data to them. The other aspect is that many of the military facility data is also available on individual tank data websites. This has never been put together at a national scale, so we're also going to have a conversation with the Defense Logistics Agency as well to show them this information and to make them aware of the data that is available, obviously in disparate sources at the moment, but just also before we would actually publish this.
So that takes care of all of the written questions. I'm actually going to call out one person. Sorry to do that. Angela and Indiana, you do have your hand raised, and I saw a few questions you already sent in. Has everything been addressed that you wanted to ask, or did you have any other questions?
Hi, this is Indiana. We were kind of wondering if there's a process for when we identify errors for getting those corrected, or is there a way that we can submit updated data sets to you? Because we would be glad to do that.
Charles was assisting us in the review in general, so comments obviously could come back to him. If you have specific questions or have specific data that you would like to provide, it would be best to contact Alex directly regarding those questions or additional data.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and once we do get the points of contact, I think Fran and Alex mentioned earlier, we'll have sort of instructions for what we're looking for to review the data, how to submit information about errors or new data sets. So we'll provide all of that once we get the points of contacts finalized. Were there any other questions that folks wanted to ask over the phone using the audio? Just hit the raise hand button next to your name. All right, I'm not seeing any. Before I turn it over to the panelists to close out, just a reminder again, before you leave, if you already know your point of contact, send it as a question so I can just save those and wrap some of these up. If not, look toward an email going out to all the folks on this webinar early next week, and then also my UST and LUST contacts through ASTSWMO, just to get that point of contact identified so we can provide with some follow-up information and data sets to review. Did any of the panelists or presenters have anything else?
Hey, Charles, this is Will from OUST. Carolyn had to step out, but I just wanted to thank ORD again, as well as all the states who called in or who are willing to participate in this effort to review the data. As Carolyn mentioned at the beginning, we've never had a national view, a national data set, so this is a great, excellent first step. So many, important questions were brought up during the webinar. I know Fran and Alex have said that this is sort of the beginning. We want to work together with ASTSWMO in the states to figure out the best path forward. So thanks to everybody, and look forward to moving this forward together.
All right, and thank you all again for participating. Again, this is recorded, so it's going to be made available hopefully early next week. Again, when I send out that announcement on the ASTSWMO website as a web link, so you can send out to any staff, or if you want to review the questions again, I'll be sure to make that available.
And this is Fran. Thanks again, Charles and ASTSWMO, for all your support in this effort, and certainly to the ASTSWMO task forces who've been invaluable, and ultimately to the states for your contributions and your consideration in reviewing this data. And we certainly look forward to hearing back from you, and also as well, if you have specific parameters that you'd like into the future, we're most welcome to consider those, and look forward to your input on that.
All right, thank you again. I'm going to keep the webinar up for 5 minutes if you do want to submit any last questions that we can answer after the line or your point of contact. And hope everybody has a great weekend.